Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gamer video. Today's keyword would be performance, because we're going to talk about Fable Legends, specifically the DirectX 12 functionality that's being built right into the PC and the Xbox One versions of the game, and what the developers are managing to achieve thanks to DX12, at least in comparison to DirectX 11, and then we're going to move right on over to the Fury X2, which of course is an upcoming, soon-to-be released graphics card from AMD, which essentially straps two Fury X's, or I guess more accurately two Fury Nanos, on the same PCB, and puts out a ludicrous amount of compute performance. So, starting things out with DirectX 12. We've heard a lot about DirectX 12 for some time now. Of course, it's been almost like the white knight that PC owners in particular have been super duper excited about. Now, Fable Legends will be using DirectX 12, and the reasons, at least according to Stuart White over at Lionhead, is, and I quote, "The team was able to achieve a significant amount of horsepower, resulting in increased visual fidelity, higher frame rates, and improved shadows and visual effects." Now, a lot of this will come down at the end of the day to the graphics card, because DirectX 12 is still linked to the hardware. It can't magically increase the performance of the hardware. It can just better and more efficiently use the hardware that it's running on. But depending on your system, you could see up to a 40% faster performance using DX12 compared to a DirectX 11 rendering. Now, what about the Xbox? Well, according to White, he says, and I quote, "Fable Legends is using a number of features on the Xbox One, including asynchronous compute and efficient multi-threaded rendering, and this will mean the developer can," I quote, "push the visual bar higher than it otherwise would be possible." Now, let's just be honest here. Because the Xbox One is fixed hardware, we're not going to see massive jumps in performance. For example, the Xbox One is suddenly not going to be capable of rendering at 4K 60 FPS or something along those lines. And this is even what Phil Spencer himself has said a couple of times over. I'll read a short part of his previous statements on DirectX 12 question. I was asked early on by people if DX12 is going to dramatically change the graphical capabilities on Xbox One, and I said it wouldn't. I'm not trying to rain on anyone's parade, but the CPU, GPU, memory on the Xbox One don't change when you go to DX12. DX12 just makes it easier to do some of the things that Xbox One is good at, which will be nice, and we'll see an improvement in games that use DX12, but it's not going to be dramatic, essentially. And I can go along with that. What we're going to see is efficiency improvements, which is pretty much part and parcel of any console's generation. Obviously, the first year or so, you see a definite improvement over the previous generation. So in this case, for example, you see the Xbox One, for sake of argument, was definitely an improvement over the original Xbox, or rather the Xbox 360, just as the Xbox 360's lineup, or initial lineup of games, was an improvement over the Xbox. And then a couple of years later, you really start to see the system start hitting the stride. And then towards the very end of the console's life, that's pretty much when the developers have managed to wrangle every last little bit of performance they can. They've figured out all the intricacies, they've figured out how they can get the most out of the memory, they've figured the most out of the CPU, the GPU, and any other buffers or caches or whatever else it can to get every last squeeze of performance out of the system. And this is of course very much like anything from the Sega Saturn to the PlayStation 2, and so on. But with the Xbox One, with DirectX 12, the fact that it will be DX12 essentially as an API, it means that we're going to see better compute performance. It means that we're going to see nicer looking games, and at the end of the day, it should be easier to get the most out of the system. As far as what we understand from leaks, remember the entire SDK of the Xbox One was actually leaked a while back, and we've done an in-depth analysis of that all the way down pretty much every single component, every single piece of software. The Xbox One did undergo some significant changes through its developmental life and even its retail life. So for the sake of argument, obviously, we've seen a couple of different graphics card drivers which were used on the system. The latter ones were considerably more efficient, more powerful, more robust. We've seen improvements to ESRAM utilization, we've seen improvements to just general multitasking, we've seen the unlocking of the 7th CPU core for games developers. And all of this is kind of cool stuff, and obviously we're going to see the improvements as it continues. Now, moving on to AMD. So, the R9 Fury X2, also known as an equally unwieldy name, the Gemini Dual GPU, has been in development for some time now. Essentially, it is a Fury Nano times 2. It's basically 2 GPUs using high bandwidth memory, 4 gigabytes, with very much the same specifications as the Nano, and using liquid cooling. It's really cool stuff, if you will, and it has been delayed a couple of times. One of the reasons that AMD have cited this is because of virtual reality. Essentially, they said they wanted to see what happens with the virtual reality market and then release accordingly. Roy Taylor from AMD was happy to demonstrate just how much performance the Fury X2 Dual GPU is going to be able to put out at the VRLA. And how much? Well, about 12 T-flops of SP Compute single precision. Now, how does that relate to other cards? Well, let's take the other dual GPU that AMD have recently put out. I say recently, I guess it's kind of recent, and that would be the R9 295X2. Now, the difference in performance is actually not massive on the face of it. It's just 500 G-flops, that's 11.5 compared to 12, obviously, the 12 being the Fury X2, but the primary difference here is not actually the level of performance, it's the difference in efficiency between the two GPUs. It's around a 40% difference in power efficiency, simply because the 95X2 is a hungry beast. It's about a 500 watts TDP, whereas the Fury X2 is just 375, which is absolutely gargantuan. And obviously, this is just going to get better in the future when we start seeing the reduction of manufacturing sizes of dies. I guess we might as well tackle a few other small points as well. The Polaris GPU was also talked about, but in a very rudimentary fashion, no extra details like, for example, the clock speeds or anything, actually solid information. But specifically, it's more about the manufacturing of the card, 14nm. So as you all know, both Nvidia and AMD have been, I guess, chasing the size reduction for some time now. Let's face it, we've been on 28nm for some time, and for example with AMD, and I guess we're at the point now where we really need to make the leap forward. AMD are pointing to the 14nm Nirvana and telling us that with the next generation of architectures, they're going to really shape virtual reality. Virtual reality is going to be everywhere, at least according to a lot of companies. Remember, it's not just a case of we are gamers, we are going to use virtual reality sets. They could be used for everything. Anything from, let's say, surgeon simulations, let's say as a doctor. You might say that's crazy and you might immediately get the example of like the video game on Steam, but in reality it's probably going to be very complex simulations being put together. It could be anything from, I don't know, astronaut training and God knows what else is going to be put together and over the next few years from these improvements in HMDs. And then finally, AMD did also mention their improvements to drivers. So as you probably are aware, AMD have done some pretty big changes, made some pretty big changes to their drivers, which we talked a lot about them in the R9 380X review a while back. Essentially, their drivers are now known as Crimson. No, I did not inspire the name for once. And basically, the drivers had some changes in regards to the GUI. It's a lot more efficient now, it's simpler to use and all the other stuff, which is obviously a good thing. But what they want to do is essentially bring their drivers up to par against Nvidia. Nvidia, to be honest, for some time have had some really good drivers. Even back in the day, like let's say the early 2000s, Nvidia's drivers were pretty rock solid. ATI's had some really nice features. This was before AMD bought them out. You could always say AMD were really good for like TV output, they were really good for like color saturation, changing like the color and all of that, where Nvidia's were very good for gaming and a lot simpler to use. And essentially AMD have done some changes obviously over the years, but they want to bring it to the next level. However, it's really DirectX 12, Liquid VR, and the next generation of APIs as a whole that AMD are focusing on now. And that's kind of a problem because AMD's GPUs do have a bit of an extra CPU overhead, although this has improved running DirectX 11 code, which is one of the reasons obviously that Nvidia's GPUs do have slightly lower CPU usage. But to AMD's credit, they have done a number of changes which has improved this, and obviously that's a good thing. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Have you found it informative? Well, hopefully you have. If you could do the likey thing, the subscribey thing, I would be very appreciative, and the rest of us would, of course, at RGT as well. But for now, I'm going to leave you to it. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.